Ilan Pappé is the world-renowned historian who wrote The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. He's a professor of history and co-director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK. His new book is called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, and it's published by Oneworld. It tells the story of what is today called the Israel Lobby, from its origins as a Christian evangelical movement in 19th century Britain. The idea of establishing a Jewish settler colony in Palestine was then taken up by such early Zionist leaders as Theodore Herzel and 𝐓𝐿 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐿, who focused on cultivating high-level connections with European empires and governments to advance their project. The Israel lobby remains enormously powerful and a subject of controversy, and we're going to talk about it more now, along with his reactions to the most recent developments across Palestine. Ilan Pappé, welcome back to the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be on this platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilan. I wish that we had happier things to talk about, and we're going to talk about your incredible new book. But before that, we want to get your reaction to a couple of things in the news, starting first of all with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of the Politburo of Hamas in Iran this morning. Israel has refused to comment. Do you think there's any doubt who did it?
No, I don't think so. And listening to Israeli media, I always remember Ali, you saying that Israelis think that Hebrew is a secret language that nobody understands. So listening to their discussions with people they talk to who are very close to the policymakers and so on, it's very clear that Israel is behind that assassination.
And what do you think Israel, tell us as a historian about Israel's history of using assassination, in fact, the Zionist movement's history of assassination, because it predates the state of Israel. What is it supposed to achieve in the minds of the Zionist rulers, and what has been the result in reality?
Yeah. First of all, you're right. It started long before. I think that the kind of the early decisions to try and target personally Palestinian political leaders, intellectuals, journalists goes back to the 1930s. The first program we have historically is back from 1946. This was a very specific program with names of people the Israelis thought, the Zionists at the time before Israel, thought were leading intellectuals and political figures in the Palestinian society, and they were listed as targets for assassination. And then, as we know, this continued to be the pattern. Now, what is behind it? I think there are two kind of frameworks that the Israelis are using here that shows their Orientalist, colonialist perception of the Palestinians. One is it connects, I think, with the whole dehumanization of the Palestinians in the sense that Palestinians are not as modern or as progressive as the Israelis are. This kind of Orientalist view on the Arab world as being more primitive, more traditional, and therefore totally being loyal or obedient to leaders, and a leaderless kind of society or a group of people or a crowd is much easier to deal with, and you can really change its whole behavior if you only hit the one who is at the top of this group here, a nation or a tribe, and so on, which is a very old colonialist, Orientalist view on Arab societies and on Western societies. This is one, well, I call it framework. Maybe one should call it one impulse. One impulse is kind of this Orientalist / colonialist. The second one is a very primitive Israeli kind of idea that for domestic reasons you should use revenge, especially as a replacement for your inability actually to deal with the real problem that you are facing. Uh, uh, the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh is and the assassination of the of Hezbollah leaders is a very good example for this. Israel is one of its most difficult periods. It is unable to defend its citizens in the north. It's not doing a very good job in Gaza in the south, despite of the genocide. And the state is not functioning. The government is not functioning, and they want to package these assassinations as good news. You know, after 9 or 10 months of bad news, finally we have some good news. Uh, for anyone normal with a modicum of humanity and decency, that would look very bizarre, at least, if not totally insane, but not from their perspective. This is, if you want, these are the only good news from their perspective that they can now deliver. And they celebrate it in the Israeli media as good news. And then suddenly they're being reminded by relatives of the hostages that maybe it's not such good news for the hostages, for instance. So even that is not working too well for them. But I think throughout history, this was the idea that you are, because this kind of reductionist analysis of who the Palestinians are, what is the Palestinian Liberation Movement, and how you can defeat its resistance to the Zionist project and its oppression. And it failed, as you know. It never worked. There is not one case where any of these assassinations changed the course of history, weakened the Palestinian determination to resist, changed the ability of Israel to control or not to control. These were just bloody assassinations that have not contributed anything in terms of Israel's own perception of security and achievement, and definitely only contributed to the Palestinian sense of or knowledge of who they are facing, and those who support the Palestinians. Definitely, it strengthened their images of what Israel is all about and its moral values and behavior.
Hmm. So, Ilan, we may come back to this theme of Israeli morality, I think several times in this discussion, but we also wanted to ask you about another, each day now seems like it's a month in terms of so much happening. But it was just this week, believe it or not, that we saw these extraordinary, horrifying scenes in Israel. On Monday, Israeli military police attempted to arrest 9 soldiers suspected of a brutal and sustained sexual torture of a Palestinian detainee in the notorious Sde Teman torture camp. They were met by a mob of rioters, including even some members of the Knesset, who are essentially defending the right to rape Palestinian detainees. Thousands of Palestinians have been taken to the Sde Teman and other torture centers in Israel, and consistent survivor accounts point to systematic torture of the most brutal kind, sometimes to the point of death. And there's been absolutely no accountability for this. In this particular case, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports that the sexual torture and rape was so severe that the Palestinian detainee suffered from a ruptured bowel, a severe injury to his anus, lung damage, and broken ribs, and required surgery. This apparently upset many Israelis who think that torturing Palestinians is perfectly fine, but providing them with medical care is not. Yoel Donchin, the Israeli doctor who examined the man, told Haaretz, quote, "If the state and Knesset members think there's no limit to how much you can abuse prisoners, they should kill themselves like the Nazis did or close the hospitals." He said, if they maintain a hospital only for the sake of defending ourselves at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That's no good, end quote. Ilan, can you make sense of these developments for us? What does this tell us about the state of Israeli society 10 months into this genocide?
I think it exposes a process that already began had begun before the 7th of October, probably became visible, especially after the November 22 national elections in Israel, where one section of the Israeli Jewish society, which I called in several places the state of Judea, these are the kind of section that was emerged in the Jewish settlements in the West Bank with other sections of the society, with a messianic view about Zionism, a racist view towards not only Palestinians but also towards secular Jews, people who used to be considered to be on the margins of the Israeli society in politics and now becoming a force to reckon with, that entered almost every part of the Israeli military and security apparatuses, definitely has representation, a strong representation in the Israeli Knesset and in the cabinet. Now, this kind of messianic version of Zionism is probably the worst manifestation of Jewish racism we ever had in history of Judaism, and there was always some racism like in any other religion, but this is the worst one that we've ever seen, and they are the base on which Netanyahu is kind of building his political support for the next elections. So you have this section of the Israeli society taking over every part of the Israeli state and government. Against them, you have still sections who I wouldn't call them liberal or progressive because they have never objected to the apartheid state of Israel, but they wanted still to have, an image of a more liberal, progressive society. Definitely for the Jews, people are really worried about rulings by the ICJ and the ICC, and their motive for trying to investigate the torture of this particular Palestinian really is connected to the ICC and ICJ. Because, Ali, if you think about it, if this tortured Palestinian has not reached a certain doctor in a certain hospital, you and I might have known about it, but it would not be in the public eye in Israel. There would not be this kind of thing. The doctor's report was the doctors were so adamant that the only reason for the wounds that they have examined can come from such a torture was something that, at least those who want to prevent from the international legal system to investigate Israel by claiming that Israel can investigate itself, immediately they rose to action. So this is part of I would say, of the atmosphere that Israel is in it. What I'm always kind of surprised, even dismayed, because I was born here, and I was born there in Israel and so on, so I still have some friends and family, is that those people who are supposedly shocked by what they have what they have seen, both the torture itself and the mob attack on the two military bases and the military court, if you try to have an educated conversation with them and say, do you understand why it's happening? Do you understand the historical context, the moral context? You won't get very far. You won't get very far. They would say, yes, we have these horrible people, but this doesn't say anything about Zionism. It doesn't even say anything of our right to genocide in Gaza, to torture people in Sde Teman. It just means that we can't be that excessive, and we don't like these other people anyway. because they're also our enemies. But it's not a conversation you can have about what is the source of this kind of behavior, and that is, saddens me, because it really means that we cannot anticipate a significant change from within the Israeli Jewish society in the near future.
Oh, yeah. And that time is long overdue. Ilan, let's turn to your book, Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, which just came out. Congratulations. You weave storytelling and analysis in such a compelling way, as you do in all of your books. Early on, you observed that, quote, in the 20th century, the primary driver of lobbying was to ensure support and legitimacy for the colonization of Palestine throughout the British Mandatory period, 1918 to 1948. This required tremendous amounts of advocacy and lobbying of all persuasions. You go on to say, quote, but the logic of lobbying turned into a conundrum in the 21st century. Why does Israel still lobby for its legitimacy more than 75 years after its establishment, especially given its objective political and economic power? You point out that the, quote, resources thrown into courting world powers and silencing dissent have only increased since Israel appeared on the map. In a nutshell, how did you approach answering this conundrum, and what are the goals of the Israel lobby?
Yeah, definitely. When I look at it as a conundrum, I also think about the fact that this is an ongoing effort for more than 100 years. That the main reason that it continues is because it doesn't solve the conundrum. Had the conundrum been solved, there was no need for so much effort, and as you said rightly, for increasing all the time the efforts. And I think that it shows you that this whole idea of Zionism, as it emerged eventually as a practical project. I'm not talking about early ideas and vision and imaginations, but once it unfolded as a project of displacement of Palestinians and their replacement by Jewish settlers under the umbrella of the British mandate, it became very clear, first of all, to the leaders of Zionism, and then to those who support it, that there is a real problem there in defending this particular project of colonization. First of all, because of its historical timing. It came at a time where more and more people around the world were actually thinking about decolonization rather than colonization, where human rights kind of agendas became more, people were more familiar with. Information flew more than a century before about what was going on in certain places. And another problem was that your own people, so to speak, that is, members of Jewish communities around the world, Christians around the world, and whether you thought that socialists should support you or liberals should support you, among all these places, the moment even a sliver of the reality was known, questions were asked about the legitimacy and validity of this project. So I think especially the historical timing and the fact that people already knew and had a different, maybe, moral positions towards colonialism meant that you need to use a lot of power, money, intimidation to make sure that this project is supported, and that anyone who has, a modicum of decency in them and would be against it would be silenced, defamed in a way that would make sure that the project would continue. The last thing I would say about it, that it was an evolving project. And that's one thing that why the lobby needed to be perfected all the time. Zionism could not fulfill all its ambition very early on in terms of capacity, circumstances. It needed to take more territory. And when it took more territory of historical Palestine, it faced more Palestinians under its rule. And its brutal actions against Palestinians created the Palestinian resistance movement. And they haven't been able to solve the problem in its entirety from their perspective. And the use of more power in order to deal with the completeness, if you want, of the Zionist project led to more questions asked, not about a certain policy, but about the validity of the project itself. So it is a kind of understanding by the people themselves who do all these things in the name of Zionism that there is a problem, not because they morally think there is a problem, maybe, but because they understand that a lot of people they would like to support the project, and maybe they think they need them to support the project, might have these problems with it. So you have all the time to be engaged with it, with validation and invalidation of those who reject the project and criticize and expose it for what it is.
Mm. Ilan, it's really, congratulations. It's really a tremendous book, and it's such a, it's hard to use the word pleasure in the context of so much misery and sadness and horror, but it is a pleasure to read a book and learn new things, even about a topic that one feels they know a lot about. And I've been learning something new with almost every page in your book. And one of the slightly amusing things is how Theodore Herzel, who is often thought of as the founder of the, let's call it the practical Zionist movement, as to use your term, was himself not interested and quite horrified about the idea of going to Palestine. He didn't even want to visit, but he did travel around trying to win support for Zionism. You describe him visiting London. Of course, he was traveling all around Europe and finding a lot of opposition from Jews themselves who wanted nothing to do with this. So it became very clear to the early Zionist leaders that they needed elite support. And so they made great efforts to try to win support from the British, French, Ottoman, German, and ultimately US imperial powers for their settler colonial project. So talk about the relationship between Zionism and imperialism. Historically speaking, and in the present, could there be Zionism without imperialism? And conversely, does imperialism need Zionism?
Yeah, thank you, Ali. I really think that a lot of people would be surprised how, contrary to the Zionist narrative itself, it was not a bottom-up project. Zionists would like to say this was enthusiasm. The people themselves wanted it. Those who suffered from anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, that's what they wanted. They wanted to go to Palestine. It was a very it's kind of a project that had been devised from the leadership and manipulated people to believe that this is their destiny, but it was by no means a popular movement, and that's very important to remember. If you look at the Jews who were suffering from anti-Semitism when Romantic nationalism took over the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century, most of them wanted to go to Britain and the United States. And in fact, what Theodore Herzel offered Britain and the United States is a project that the anti-Semites in Britain and the United States liked very much, namely that these Jews would not come to Britain and the United States, but would rather go to Palestine. And for British imperialists, this was not just a way of preventing poor Jews, some of them they suspect of being socialists, coming to London, but you can use these Jews to extend the British Empire, expand the British Empire over the former territories that belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And so I think from the very beginning, the Zionist lobby understood that in order to have a foothold in Palestine, you have to convince the empire of the day, and this is Britain until 1948, and the empire of tomorrow, which will be the United States, that having a Jewish Palestine is in their imperial interests. Now, what worked in the case of Britain was an interesting combination, and they were very effective, these Zionist lobbyists, in understanding how actually the religious part of British imperialism was, namely that there was a strong evangelical Christian base to British imperialism that a lot of historians of British imperialism have missed in their books. I couldn't find any book that really understood it to the very to this level that I think I did bring it in my book. That this was kind of a combination by people who wanted not only to sustain the British Empire but to increase its power, but also in the case of Palestine, adding this theological part of it by saying that, you know, a British presence in Palestine and a Jewish British presence in Palestine would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead, the end of time. People really believed in it, right? I mean, this is not just manipulation. So it was a Christian kind of imperialism together with the more capitalist, if you want, imperialism that made sure that Palestine would be a coveted asset in the eyes of British policymakers after the First World War, which was not so easy to do for two reasons. One, Palestine was not that strategically important for Britain. Actually, before Zionism was very active, Britain was willing to give part of Palestine to the French should the war happen. And secondly, there were already voices for genuine, less genuine, it doesn't matter, reasons, especially among prominent Jews in Britain in particular, but also in the United States, who were aware of the presence of the Palestinians, and even more importantly, thought that Zionism would raise questions of dual loyalty about Jews. Namely, it would not be a panacea for anti-Semitism, it actually would increase anti-Semitism, which was a prophetical warning that indeed happened. Now, later on, yes, I think Zionism needed American imperialism to sustain a hostile, I would say even violent presence at the heart of the Arab world, at the heart of the Muslim world, by daily oppressing millions of people who reject this kind of colonization and rule. The Zionist project and later the State of Israel was not powerful enough to do it by itself. This has to do also with the fact that this is not an island. Palestine is within the heart of the Arab world. And American imperial, it had to serve American imperialism, and for many years it did, in terms of the oil production in the Middle East, in terms of the arms industry that was looking for markets, in terms of the Cold War, and then after the Cold War, making sure that there is no challenge to American domination in the area. So historically, I would say that without imperialism, first British, then American, there would be very little chance for the Zionist project to survive, which shows you what kind of an alliance the Palestinians were facing, who were mostly pastoral people, many of them living in rural areas. I mean, they were facing a global imperialist alliance that targeted their homeland as something that has to be uprooted and replaced. Now, you ask about the future. I think that the main problem for Israel today, that from an imperialist point of view, even from a capitalist point of view, it is not anymore the asset that it was. It's not. If you look at the American military industry, they now have clients all over the Arab world. Unfortunately, I mean, not only there, in the global South, they have good clients. Gone are the days that having a research and development and purchase relationship between the American military industry and Israel was also beneficial for the American industry in terms of employment, profits, and so on. No, I think Saudi Arabia and the Gulf offers a far better market for American military industry than Israel does. Israeli military agreements with America create problems, and so on. So I think because American imperialism is not as powerful as it was, it's not a unipower world we're in it. We have other powers. And therefore, I think that because there is this need for imperialist backing, without imperialist backing, it will not be the only factor, but it's one of the major factors that lead me to believe. It's hard to convince people that, but I do believe in it as an academic, not just as an activist, that we are facing the beginning of the end of Zionism. Because of that problem, that imperialism in its 21st century kind of fashion or mode has with a project like Israel, given the other interests that imperialism brings with it to the fore.
It's really, as you're speaking, Ilan, I'm really thinking about the historical continuity here, because in the book, you talk about how the early Zionist leaders like Herzl, like Chaim Weizmann, the way they marketed the Zionist project to British leaders like Arthur Balfour, who was prime minister and then later became foreign secretary at the time he issued the infamous Balfour Declaration of 1917. Balfour was an evangelical Christian. He was an anti-Semite. And so the way they marketed the Zionist project to the British Empire was to say, look, instead of all these Russian Jews coming from Tsarist Russia to London and to the UK, to Britain, let's send them to Palestine. We rid you of the so-called Jewish problem. So the Zionists always tried to market themselves as being an asset to the empire. And when you compare that with Netanyahu's grotesque speech in Congress with the 58 standing ovations, albeit with half of the members of Congress choosing to boycott it, he was making a similar pitch. He was saying, our war is your war. Our enemies are your enemies. We are fighting for you. We're on the front line for you. And I think that's a message that probably used to resonate more strongly. It still resonates with a significant segment of the elites and even the public in the United States, the more right-wing, the more religious, the more, but more and more people feel alienated from that. But that continuity really struck me in reading the book and listening to you speak.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the structures, the historical structure in which this lobby is operating, within which this lobby is operating, are really patterns of continuity. You're absolutely right. And it's always the need to market Israel as an asset. But you can also see the problem. It's very difficult to market it as a moral asset. It's easy to market, wasn't that easy, but they were trying to market it as a strategic asset, as an imperial asset, and so on. And then they were faced with a civil society. I don't know exactly when it happened, maybe with the civil rights movement in America, maybe with the student revolutions in the late 60s in France, but we didn't notice, but civil society in the global north became more and more distant, at least important sections in it, became more distant from the foreign policies of their own societies, of their own states. And the lobby, all the kind of weapons or the kit of tools that the lobby had is not fitting, cannot be used properly for dealing with issues that are based on a moral evaluation of foreign policy, that it connects people's fighting against injustice in their own societies with the injustice in Palestine. So I agree that still today, large section in American society would still buy into Netanyahu's narrative that Israel's war against whoever it is Americans' war. But I think it's very difficult to sell it to a generation that is far more knowledgeable because of alternative media, because maybe of visits to the place, and contrary to what people thought, are wishing for politics to be something else from what they see, especially in America, this kind of bribery politics that we have. The more money you have, the better your chances, and all these kinds of things that I don't know who thought that always there will be a young generation that would say, oh, it's fine, we have no problem with it. No, young people have a problem with it. It is true that later on we lose some of that rejection of the cynicism of politics, of the injustice that is incurred in it, but not all of us are losing it. And I think less and less of us are losing it. And that's where I wonder how a lobby that is based on this mafia kind of mentality can deal with it. And I think it won't be able to deal with it in the long run. And this for me is a hopeful sign. Of course, it's powerful enough to prevent the United States to stop the genocide. I want to be very clear about it. And I'm not underestimating the moment we are in history. But I would like to look a little bit further and to say that the lobby is part of the immunity shield that Israel enjoys for perpetrating the genocide. But this shield has a lot of holes in it. And they would grow. They would grow. Even in the United States. I don't take a determinist view on American policy in the future. I refuse to take teleological determinist views on the future, and I believe that that's why activism is so important in America. And we should never despair of the possibility also of changing American policy, which would be a very crucial factor, not the only one, but a very crucial factor in the liberation of Palestine.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's been very clarifying, especially for activists and young people, students, over the last 10 months, to see the direct, the correlation between American imperial policies and plans, and how Israel is a key factor in those plans, and how really Western imperialism operates, whether it's here in the belly of the beast, whether it's in the UK, or whether it's in occupied Palestine, Israel. Ilan, the Israel lobby, as we know it today in the United States, really began to build up its power in the early 1960s. You write in your book about William Fulbright, who was a prominent senator and head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in that period. He gave his name to the Fulbright scholarships that continue today. And you call him the first political victim of the Israel lobby in the US. You write that Fulbright became the Israel lobby's arch nemesis, and he had to be deposed by any means possible. Tell us more about who Fulbright was, what he did to anger the lobby, and what the repercussions were and continue to be for anyone with any modicum of power or influence when they stand up to the lobby.
Yeah. Fulbright came from Arkansas, and he came with he had sort of two impulses in his decision to be a public figure. He was a very legal person. He cared about the law and abiding by the law on the one hand, and he was very interested in international relationship. So he was very interested in foreign policy, and he thought as much as he could, despite a short period where I think he was totally wrong on Vietnam, but then he changed his views, thank God, and adopted a more reasonable position on Vietnam. But all in all, he was trying to inject legal and moral values into foreign policy. And to his great surprise, and with no particular axe to grind, but because of the positions he held in the foreign affairs committees and so on, he was the kind of evidence he saw was so accessible and public, because AIPAC did not think that anyone would dare to deal with them. It's not that he needed, he didn't need the FBI or some very clandestine operations to expose it. It was very much in the open, and I think he couldn't believe his eyes when he first understood how AIPAC operates as part of his wish in the early 60s to make sure that foreign countries do not interfere in American politics. I mean, that was his main agenda. And then he finds out that the main foreign country, contrary to the McCarthy school of thought that is all the Soviet Union and the Cold War, he found out that actually the one foreign state that really interferes against American law in American policy is Israel. And he exposed one of the major things that really outraged him, that AIPAC was recruiting money in the United States, supposedly to help the less fortunate sections of the Israeli Jewish society. And the money was supposed to go to deprived areas in Israel. But then he found that a large part of that money went back to the United States to finance the lobby, which was a total violation of American regulations. And he did not only prepare a report, he gave the gist of the report to Newsweek. And there was a special issue was devoted to it in Newsweek. And there was one step too much for AIPAC. And it was the first time they faced such a danger, if you want, that they might be, canceled, if you want, on the basis of violating American policies. And they went into action. And this is a system they've developed before, but it was the first time they exercised it in full. The one way of destroying someone's political career was to go to the rival of that person, to support him in the next elections, and to make sure that the one you're targeting is not being re-elected. I bring a quote from Fulbright's own rival in the elections after he was exposed by AIPAC, who says, "The Zionist lobby filled my coffers with money, more money than I ever needed in order to defeat Fulbright in the elections." So it was a model that they would use later with many other cases. Understanding the way American politics work, money is very important for your success of being elected or losing the elections. And but there was something more important, I think, that I bring in the book. They used Fulbright in order to intimidate potential further politicians who might do the same. One thing that I really found incredible is when I talked, I didn't even bring it to the book because the guy asked me eventually not to do it. Doesn't matter, so I won't mention name. But I talked with someone who was the deputy chair. And he told me that, I mentioned it, I hint to this in the book, that at one point, AIPAC in the 1990s understand it's not enough to use this method, namely, I'll support you and you will win, or if you're not with me, I'll support your rival, right? This is not enough. You needed to have a presence on Capitol Hill. And as he put it, you need to leave the door open of the AIPAC office in Capitol Hill, and every now and then take senators to see someone in that office being reprimanded for not following faithfully the instruction of the lobby. So to make, kind of teach them a lesson. And he said that was intentional policy. We left the door open. We raised our voices. We wanted people to this is, it's frightening. And people who wants to deal with it, especially when there is no counter lobby. There's no someone who will say, "Oh, don't worry, if you don't get the money from them, I'll give you the money." Or what people say, as some brave politicians said, "I don't care. It's not just about money." But how many do we have like this? Yeah.
Ilan, your book, you point out in the book that the Israel lobby encompasses more than just the United States and Britain. It's, of course, as we know, in many countries, but you focus on this transatlantic axis because, in a sense, it's been the most significant. So thinking now about, you describe that what Fulbright did that so angered the lobby is that he investigated its financing and found many criminal connections. And when you said mafia-like, literally there was mob, criminal financing and schemes that he discovered. And he thought that AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, still the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill, should be registered as a foreign agent. It is still not registered as a foreign agent, even though it's obvious to everyone that it is acting on behalf of a foreign entity. But shifting to, let's say, another similar episode, modeled perhaps on the Fulbright example, but more recent, and in the UK. As a historian, what's your reading of the lobby's vicious and ultimately successful campaign to destroy Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the British Labour Party, using the totally manufactured anti-Semitism crisis? As you point out in the book, when you boil it down, really, Corbyn's actual views have been well within the mainstream of Western consensus. He recognizes Israel and supports the so-called two-state solution, although he called for ending arms sales to Israel. In fact, I think he did that for the first time, or at least most clearly, in an interview for the Electronic Intifada with our colleague Asa Winstanley. But he has, to my knowledge, never really clearly endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, at least during his leadership of the Labour Party. Although no one really doubts his sincerity as a supporter of Palestinian rights, even if we may disagree with him here and there. But given all that, given his relative moderation, what made Jeremy Corbyn such a uniquely dangerous threat in the eyes of the Israel lobby, and what lessons can we draw from that experience?
I think that and you're right to connect it also to Fulbright. The lobby has to prove its power. And in order to prove its power, the target is not necessarily someone who can really endanger, if you want, the interests of Israel necessarily. And I fully agree with you. Jeremy Corbyn views, by the way, correspondent to center-left ideas in Israel itself. It's not as if he joined a particularly anti-Zionist movement. But if someone like this gets the leadership of the Labour Party, then the lobby that sometimes doesn't even work for the sake of Israel, but works for its own power, is failing. And I think the viciousness was not necessarily directed from Israel itself. Don't misunderstand me. Jeremy Corbyn was attacked at the time of the Netanyahu years, and nobody would suspect me of giving Netanyahu any credit about anything. But it was really, anybody would think that Israel was there, or the prime minister was there on the phone all the time with the lobby, would be mistaken. The lobby, it was the lobby's project. It was not high on the agenda of the Israeli foreign policy even. And that's why it's a power for the sake of power, as I put it in the book. And that's why the viciousness, and that's why these amazing kind of methods used in order to defame someone who devoted his political life against anti-Semitism and racism. And I think it both shows the power of the lobby, but it also shows its weaknesses, because it alienated a lot of people. I know that we sometimes think, because of the mainstream media in Britain, that it was a very successful campaign, because after all, they did destroy his political career. But it didn't create more confidence among large sections in the British society in the mainstream media. It didn't give them more credit points. More people moved to alternative media. It didn't prevent progressive elements in the Labour Party to increase their power. It didn't prevent 1 million people to demonstrate against the genocide in London. for the first time, we're going to have in the British Parliament only 5, it's true, but we will have 5 independent members of parliament who whose support for Palestine is one of the main reasons they were voted in their constituencies as independent members of parliament. This is very important. Their presence will be very important. So I think, all in all, this is a vicious, a cruel attack on someone who also, was relatively an easy target. I mean, I can think of some other members in the Labour Party who would have withstood more successfully this kind of attack. I don't think if it's a team around him and so on. I don't think. I think he caved in where he should not have caved in. But I don't blame him totally, Ali. And Nora, you know how difficult it is when you're targeted by this lobby. So we have to be a bit generous with people. But I think I think I even said it to him personally. There is no way of satisfying this beast. If you think that you would apologize for something, if you know what I mean, if you will say, yes, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone to that funeral, or yes, this particular event, you're right, I went a bit too far, and hope that you've thrown to them something that would tame them, that would decrease their animosity or ruthlessness. It works exactly the opposite. It works exactly. Your vulnerability makes them far more vicious, far more vicious. And as I say in the book, what really surprised people who initially were supporters of Zionism in Israel is that the moment that they were not abiding totally by the directives, instruction of the lobby, they were immediately regarded enemies of the lobby. There was no gray area. There was no way where you could say, I support the state of Israel, but I'm a bit worried about this policy or other. No, the moment you do that, you're an enemy. Again, this would in the future work against them. This would work against them. But I think that is part of what I feel about the Corbyn story, that it was manipulative. The mainstream media should be ashamed in the role it played. Keith Starmer should be ashamed in the role he played in this. But I'm an historian, and I think we are seeing the second ripples, if you want, of this. And they are far more positive for the struggle for Palestine than the first one. This is not going to be a positive action in the long run. It looked successful, but I think it created a far stronger presence for pro-Palestinian position in the parliament than was before, and this will grow. This will grow. I'm really sure about that, and I think people will be less frightened and intimidated by the lobby in the future because of
that. Ilan, we have just a few questions left. But let's talk about kind of some of the bigger picture, especially just over the last 10 months. How have the events of October 7th and the genocide and everything since then changed your assessment in how you see the lobby's role and Israel's situation more generally?
I think the lobby is now facing a reality for which it has some tools in its kit it can use, but it doesn't have other tools because it never had these tools to deal with some part of that reality. And I'll explain what I mean. I think somewhere in the last 10 or 15 years, the gap between what politics means to political and economic elites and what politics means to large sections in the civil society, the gap between these two understanding what politics is all about is widening. All the time is widening. And Palestine is a very symbolic part of it. And the lobby can only be identifying itself and can only work in tandem with the politics from above, of the economic elite, of the political elite, and has very little to offer to those in the civil society who question what politics is all about nowadays in 2024. And this includes also policies towards Palestine. I can give you an example from France, actually, to show you the problem of the lobby, which I was really surprised. I happened to be in France between the first round of the elections and the second one, and I launched my book in relaunched my book in French, The Ethnic Cleansing, with a new publisher, and hundreds of young people came to the launch, and I was surprised because usually in France I don't have that kind of audience. It became a rally for the left in the elections. The launch of the ethnic cleansing was a rally before the second round to call upon young people not to sit at home, to pressure the various groups in the left to unite, and to make Palestine a crucial issue in the French elections and the policy towards the genocide. And I think, this is the failure of the French APAC, if you want, that this has become for people who won the elections, one of the reasons that they united, apart from many other issues on the social agenda, what France should look like, should be like, of course, their objection to the fascist right wing. But it was very easy to say, you see, the right wing supports Israel, not surprisingly. So this is one of the many features of fascism. Think about it. One of the main features of fascism in Britain, America, in France, is if you support Israel. I don't think we had such a situation before. I don't think we had a situation before where people who are bringing back ideology to politics, after years that we had such low-key politicians, mediocre politicians, it was all about appearance. You couldn't tell the difference with one political party to the other. We're entering a different era again, where ideology plays a role. The moral views of politicians becomes now important again. And in that moral view, and this is the success of the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, I should say, this is a solidarity movement that was working all the time. It was not, kind of passive or inactive. Palestine would be an important part of the discourse between different ideas of what politics should be like, because it epitomizes so much of the differences between that kinds of politics. And this is why I'm hopeful for the distant future. I understand it's not working yet, but these things need time to mature. But the lobby is part of the kind of politics that a lot of young people around the world, by the way, many of them are Jews, find abhorrent, find that it does not represent them, it's cynical, it's mediocre, it's self-serving, and destructive. And Israel succeeded, in inverted commas, in totally associating itself with these kinds of policies. It is connected to those who support global warming, to those who don't care about poverty, to those who persecute minorities, to those who develop arms instead of developing hospitals. Incredible. If you think about, you read my book and you say how much money they invested in this lobby, and look, what is the image of Israel today in a very important part of humanity, in a very important human, not in the political elites, but the political elites are not everything in our human globality.
Ilan, when we had you on the live stream back in March, you told us that in the short term, in the next year or 2 years at least, the situation would continue to be unbearably horrible and atrocious and could get even worse. And although you're a historian, your prophecy sadly turned out to be correct. But it's good to hear you still expressing that optimism for the long term, and I think that keeps many of us going, and it has to. We have no choice but to keep going, because we're not dealing just with abstract ideas. We're dealing with people's lives. We're trying to save lives and to amplify the voices of our colleagues in Gaza, like Dunya, who we could only have for a few minutes earlier in this program. So I just want to say I'm happy to hear you still expressing that sense of optimism, even though we are still in the darkest days and perhaps still to get darker. So I just want to give you, as we wrap up, just a chance to add anything that you think we should be paying attention to, any point you think you'd like to make.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm hopeful. I'm not optimistic. I'm hopeful. I see a difference. I think optimists are people who believe it will be okay, but there's nothing they should do about it because they're optimists by nature. I'm hopeful, and by that I mean that there are discrete processes that at this moment in time may seem destructive, but I think have potential to work for the liberation of Palestine and the end of apartheid Israel and replacement by a democratic state. But I'm hopeful because I don't think these processes, we should observe these processes. I think we can be part of them. I think we should be part of them. There are many things we can do. Not we can't do everything, but there are things that can be done in order to make sure that these processes would eventually fuse together into a transformative force that would change the reality. As an historian, I've seen it in so many places, especially in the era of decolonization. People tend to think that there was always one factor that liberated places from oppression, colonialism, fascism. No, usually these were far more complex processes. Some of them people had no control over them, but they worked for their benefit. So I think we should understand that part of the cruelty and the misery and the carnage that we are witnessing is because something is collapsing and crumbling in the very outfit or structure that is causing all this suffering. It's fierce, it's ruthless, it's violent because there are very extensive fractures in that building. And therefore we should be hopeful. And as I said, by that I mean also be part of these processes. And, like Donia, we are, I'm sure that all of us are inspired by the resistance and resilience. And I would say the last thing I would say, I always think about the irony of history. Israel created the Gaza Strip in 1948, and it thought that it found a great solution for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. It did not want to be part of Israel, and they could not move them to another Arab country. So they said, also, we'll give up 1.5% of Palestine. That's okay. And we'll create this mega prison, a mega refugee camp called the Gaza Strip. That mega refugee camp proved to be the most important source of resistance and resilience of the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And I think this shows you that even the most monstrous creation in human creation that is out of vile interests and motives can be a source of empowerment and change and liberation. As historians, we always feel that we have a bit more patience to see these long-term processes mature and to understand that you might be in the middle of something or toward the end of something, but you will only realize it a bit later in the future.
Professor Ilan Pappé, we're always inspired by and so grateful for your work and your guidance and analysis and clarity for so many of us on this issue, especially now as we look at this just horrific, relentless genocide in Gaza after 76 years of genocide and ethnic cleansing across Palestine. Again, your newest book is called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic, and it's out now. You're also a professor of history and the co-director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the UK. Dr. Pappé, it's always just, as I said, a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope to come again whenever you need me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ilan. Ahlan wa sahlan. We look forward to the next time.
Absolutely.
So do I. So do I. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's so good to always hear from him.
And that big historical perspective is so important. And I think, you know, there's so much there. I'm going to go back and listen to this whole interview, because even though I'm listening the second time, the third time, I'm going to hear a lot more than the first time. But a couple of things I picked up there, that the difference between optimism and hope for Ilan Pappé is that when he says he's hopeful, it's a reminder to us that the future is something we create. We're not simply observers. We have to be part of it. That's absolutely fundamental, and an important reminder to us. And the other is that we are in the middle of big things and we don't know what the end is, and it's not written. We have to write it.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.